Now that we're done discussing how to calculate inflation, and we saw how we were able to, through a simple calculation, look at weighted average, let's look at consumer price index. Consumer price index is the most commonly used general price index in the UK. And when we are constructing this index, we are looking at a prices of a bundle of goods and services, and we measure these prices at different points in time. And we roughly get 180,000 plus kind of individual price codes of 680 different products that we choose in our basket. We collect them each month by visiting like shops, or getting this information from like internet or the telephone. This data is then basically used to find out what we call weights, and from this weights we find out what we call weighted average to look at the inflation. Now, these weights are updated each year or timely basis, so that we can look at the consumption pattern of households, and any changes in consumption pattern need to then be shown by changing the weights for these 680 items. Well, there are three main stages when it comes to the calculation of CPI. CPI, by the way, is a major statistical task when it comes to calculation. First, what we do is that we conduct what we call a survey to find out what families buy and how much they spend on particular item. You know, this is very important because this information will then help us find out what we call weights of each of these 680 items, and it's an important job to make sure that the weights are representative of consumers household pattern. The next step is basically we record the prices of these 680 goods that we've chosen through a survey, and this information, as I said earlier, is collected from various means, but it's collected from all the main types of retail outlets, from your gas, water, electricity and transport suppliers, at what we call a particular base date. Remember, base date is the date which is your starting point from which you will be calculating inflation. The next step when it comes to our CPI calculation is this, that once we know the prices, we are now good to basically look at the weighted average for each year. So the percentage in price of each item is then multiplied by its weight to find out the weighted average, and from this the average change in the CPI is determined, and I showed through a very basic example in the last video of how that can be done. So this is how a CPI is calculated. We conduct a survey, we record the prices at base date and then at later time period, and then we find out the weighted average to find out the consumer price index. Now, when we look at CPI, CPI is very useful and is one of the most important measures in terms of looking at the performance of an economy. It can be used in terms of looking at performance in three major ways. Number one, we use it as what we call a policy target. Now, what do we mean by this? Well, price stability, keeping inflation low, is one of the most important macroeconomic goal. You want to keep inflation lower than 5%. The measure basically which help us understand what the level of inflation is in an economy is CPI. So it is basically used to calculate the average rate of inflation. Now, if this statistic is inaccurate, or basically if there is any delay in terms of calculating inflation, then it could be not good for an economy, because then whatever policy we came up with or we come up with, the direction of it or the level of action may not be inappropriate, or may be too late, or may even sometimes worsen the situation. So the idea goes this, that it is a very important policy target, and we need to make sure we calculate it correctly and also timely, in order to make sure we are able to solve an economy's problem of inflation. Another important goal that it provides us is that it is used to index payments. Now, what is indexation? Indexation is simply an idea that, let's say, if my inflation is rising by, for example, 10%. So let's write this. Let's say the inflation rate is 10%. Now, if I tell you guys this, that somebody's wages are rising, so change in wage rate, let's say, is, for example, 5%, then this guy is actually going to lose out because his real wage will be changing by 5%, in fact minus 5%, because inflation will be making, because the inflation rate is more than the wage rate. Now, if this guy comes to the employer and says, hi, my wage is rising by 5%, but inflation is 10%, I want you to protect me from this situation. So then the employer can say, okay, fine, let me index your wages, which means link it to the changes in the rate of inflation. So what he can suggest to him is that your change in wage rate will be equal to, for example, inflation rate plus, let's say, 3%, right? So I can come up with this formula where, let's say, if inflation is 10%, then my wage will go up by 13%, because 3% for my performance and 10% because I want to be protected from inflation. Now, when the inflation is 10%, my wage rate is increasing by 13%. The idea will be that overall my real wage is going to go up by 13% minus 13% minus the 10% inflation, or 3%. So I will get my increase in salary because of my performance. So indexation basically means any income is indexed to basically make up for the loss of purchasing power by making it linked to what we call our inflation rate. And this is a great way to protect people from any loss of purchasing power that can happen because of inflation. A great example is that in the US, millions of governments, sort of retired and social security recipients, are all basically protected through indexation. So whenever the inflation goes up, the payments given to these people go up. Lastly, we also use inflation to translate what we call our nominal values to real values. What does that mean? Basically, it means that in order for us to look at economic values from different periods, we must look at real rather than nominal. And for example, let's say if I give you this wage example, if, for example, somebody is receiving an interest payment of 15%, right? But let's say the inflation rate is 10%. Now, if he really wants to know his real wage, he needs to deflate this payment by 10%. In other words, CPI gives you an inflation rate, which is basically also called a deflator, which has to be removed. So 15% minus 10%, or 5%, will be the payment that ultimately you are receiving. The real interest that you're receiving is 5% and not 15%. So but you use this to look at your real values. Not only you use it to index payments to protect yourself, but also like making sure you are finding out the real variables which are adjusted for the changes in the purchasing power. So CPI is of interest to the firms and households and trade unions, because they know that they can use this data to negotiate and to plan better and to change prices accordingly.